In 2019, the United States said that Nicolas Maduro was not a legitimate president of Venezuela. That position didn't change, but the response did. For years, Maduro stayed in power. Then recently, pressure increased, sanctions were enforced, legal and diplomatic actions followed. So here's the part most people miss. If he was illegitimate in 2019, why did it only matter later? Why do governments sometimes wait years to act on positions they've already taken? And why do values seem firm in language but flexible in practice? To answer that, we need to understand something most people never see: how states really think.
So, when people say decisions exist long before actions, they're usually trying to describe almost a mismatch between what governments are thinking and what the public can see. But in reality, decisions that governments make aren't single moments in time. They're evolving positions shaped by debate, by constraint, geopolitical and domestic events, and timing. What looks like delay is often a combination of ongoing decision-making, changing conditions, and waiting for a moment when action is actually possible. And this can be shaped by so many things like public discourse, media narrative, international conditions, the electoral cycle, and so on.
When we look at politics, we usually look at it the way we look at people. We expect consistency. We expect decision to follow beliefs. But states don't work like that. And this misunderstanding is why so many global events feel confusing, frustrating, or dishonest. Most people think states make decisions the way individuals do, based on principles, emotions, or moral reactions. But states don't react, they calculate. A state doesn't ask, is this right? It asks, what does this cost? What does this change? And what does this enable later? This is why the same action can be unacceptable one year and suddenly necessary another. It's also why governments can hold the same position for years, like in Venezuela, and only act when the conditions are right. If we don't understand this, we misread almost everything: sanctions, alliances, interventions, silence. We assume inconsistency, but in reality we are seeing delayed decision. And that's why understanding how states think matters. Not to defend them, not to attack them, but to read the world more clearly.
Most government decisions don't happen in a moment. What people see as a sudden action, something they weren't anticipating, is usually the final step in a much longer internal deliberative process. By the time something becomes visible to the public, it's often been debated, adjusted, and compromised multiple times, sometimes to the point where the original intention is barely recognisable in the final product. And at the same time, not all decisions are made in calm conditions, right? In some situations, particularly during crises, people inside government are working with incomplete information, under intense pressure, often tired or stressed, or sometimes poorly advised. And in those moments, decisions are taken not because they're the right ones necessarily, but because not deciding would be worse. People talk about moral certainty. They usually mean the point at which something feels obviously right or wrong from the outside, not inside the government space, but outside. And at an individual level, that can trigger an instinct to act immediately. But governments can't afford to operate in the same way. Acting in haste, especially under emotional pressure, rarely leads to good outcomes. So inside government, there's a constant awareness that decisions taken too quickly can lock you into consequences that you can't undo. So timing becomes as much about restraint as action. Waiting isn't the absence of values, it's an attempt to avoid decisions driven purely by emotion, momentum, or public pressure, which in complex systems can often make things worse rather than better. We often talk as if governments choose between values or interests. In reality, they're constantly balancing both. At the most basic level, a government exists to protect its country's security, national interests, and advance prosperity. But how those priorities are delivered varies across the system. So different parts of government weigh those things differently. One department may be focused on domestic priorities, another on foreign affairs, another on economic stability, and so on. What plays well domestically can sometimes make international engagement more difficult, and that's why policies are debated across government, often at cabinet level, to ensure one objective doesn't unintentionally constrain another. And then what emerges isn't a pure expression of values or interests, but a negotiated outcome between them.
It's not values or interests. It's always both. They're always there at the same time. What changes is which one carries more weight. Sometimes values are heavy. They shape the direction, the language, the story. Other times interest takes over, quietly and practically. And when that happens, values don't disappear. They just stop being the deciding factor. This is why the same government can sound principled one year and pragmatic the next, without changing what it believes. It's not inconsistency, it's just priority. Here's another interesting thing. Did you know that the way governments speak in public isn't the same way things are discussed internally?
So I was the UK government spokesperson in my diplomatic roles overseas for about 10 years. And there's a real distinction between how we speak publicly and our internal discussions. So let me give you an example. Publicly, a government might say something like, we're monitoring the situation closely, we're engaging with partners and keeping all options under review. That language is quite familiar, right? It's calm, it's reassuring, and deliberately vague. It's designed to avoid panic, signal control, and really leave us some room to maneuver. When a government speaks publicly, it's actually speaking to multiple audiences at once. Its own population, other political party members, its other members of government, allies, markets, and sometimes adversaries. And so that means every word has to do several jobs at the same time. It has to reassure people, it has to avoid panic, signal intent without escalation, and preserve room to maneuver. If you're too specific too early, you can lock yourself into a position before you understand the full picture. You can spook markets, harden positions, or force reactions that you're not actually ready for. So public language is deliberately careful. It's calibrated to buy time, keep options open, and stop things getting worse while internal work continues. And that's why it often sounds repetitive or vague. It's not because nothing's happening, it's because it's sometimes saying less can be the most responsible option. Behind closed doors, however, the conversation can sound very different. Officials might be saying, we don't know how bad this could get. If we act now, we risk escalation. If we wait, we may lose leverage. Our allies aren't aligned. Our adversaries are signalling bad intent, but we don't have enough information to predict the second order effects or what's going to happen tomorrow. So that internal discussion is candid, it's messy, and it's focused on risk, not reassurance. Its job is the very opposite of public messaging. Behind closed doors is where we surface the uncertainty and figure out what's going on. People need to be able to say what they don't know, what worries them, what could go wrong, without triggering mass panic or headline. Internal discussions are about stress testing the options. What happens if we act now? What happens if we wait? Who might react badly? What haven't we thought through yet? What's the worst thing that could happen? This is also where different parts of government can challenge each other openly. So, domestic priorities versus foreign policy versus economic risk versus electoral cycle. All of those tensions are debated openly. The goal for behind the scenes, behind closed doors communications isn't reassurance, it's to reduce blind spots and avoid unintended consequences before anything becomes public. So, in summary, public language is designed to avoid panic and keep options open, whilst internal discussion is about honesty and uncertainty. Silence doesn't necessarily mean that nothing is happening. It often means something sensitive is underway, including diplomatic conversations behind the scenes. Not speaking can preserve negotiation space, it can avoid escalation, or it can prevent locking a government into a position too early. Sometimes it allows others to save face or find a compromise without having an open debate about who said what when. Sometimes it's a deliberate step back to observe what allies or adversaries are doing. Delay can also be a way of letting conditions spool out, see how the situation evolves, wait for pressure to build, or for others to move first. So these patterns repeat. You'll see them all over the place because governments everywhere operate under similar constraints. Not the same, but similar. Essentially, governments are made up of humans. They face political pressure, they're tired, they're stressed. They may be in an electoral cycle. They don't always have perfect information. There may be a media campaign against them. There's all sorts of contexts that make up the decision-making process. Every major decision is viewed through multiple lenses at once. How it plays domestically, how it lands with key constituencies, both domestically and externally, how allies might react, how adversaries might respond, and what precedent that decision sets for future decisions and policy making. Now, I want to make clear that this is the traditional way most governments operate. But occasionally the system is shaped much more directly by the psychology and instincts of a single leader. In those cases, understanding state behaviour means understanding the individual at the centre, their incentives, their worldview, and the domestic political context they're operating in. The underlying pressures are still there, they're just filtered much more strongly through one person. Hopefully, this helps make state behaviour and decision making easier to understand, even when you don't agree with it. The next time something feels like it makes no sense, slow it down and look at what might be driving it.
Different countries, different situations, same logic. States don't suddenly change their values, they change what they can afford to act on. That's why decisions appear late. That's why language shifts. That's why silence sometimes has more than action. This doesn't make state behavior good or bad. It makes it understandable. And understanding doesn't mean agreement. It just means you stop expecting governments to think the way people do. Because they don't. They calculate, they wait, and they act when the balance allows it. Once you see that, headlines hit differently, and the world starts to make a little more sense.